I'm sure that I don't have to let everybody know that these are trying times. And these are trying times because we got a lot of circumstances and situations that we're having to deal with. Well, today, we want to try to address and approach the helping to resolve and deal with one of the issues and the problems that we're having today. And I'm not calling Black Lives Matter an issue or a problem. I am saying that Black Lives Matter because it has been generated. It's caused by a certain factor, most of which deals with police interaction between the police and the public. Well, I'm glad to tell you, happy to tell you, that I got a young man on the program today, who boasts the strange combination of being a police and a pastor, an ex-police, an ex-law enforcement officer. And he thought it would not be robbery based on his experience to see if he can conceptualize an approach to dealing with the things as it relates to law enforcement and basically the African American community in an effort to try to see if he can address some of the issues and the problems in an effort and a desire to resolve it or alleviate some of the problems and move it in the right directions. And that person is none other than Pastor Gregory McClendon. I won't say Unadilla because, that might be where he lives now. Is that correct, Pastor?
No, sir. No, sir.
Where do you live?
I live here in Macon.
Oh, you live in Macon, your church?
Yes, sir. I live in Macon and churches in Dooley County.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, he lives here in Macon, but he's a pastor in, what's the name of the county?
Dooley.
Dooley.
Yes,
and
sir.
What's the city seat?
Unadilla.
Unadilla, okay. So he pastors a church in Unadilla, but he lives here in Macon. And I thought it was quite an accomplishment and quite a project for this young man to try to come up with an approach to educate the community about law enforcement based on his experience. I'd read his proposal as it relates to dealing with it, and I think it's nothing short of phenomenal. So what I wanted to do is to let the community know his concept, what he's doing, and to see if in fact there are some entities, some programs, and some organizations in the community that would benefit from his service, which I'm sure there are. This is a call to action.
A call to action.
I'm your host, Alex Habersham, and after that long introduction, I've got with me Mr. Gregory McClendon. Tell us a little about yourself. No sense in me trying to give your bio because you could do a better job, although I've read it. Greg?
Well, thank you, sir. My name is Gregory McClendon. I am a retired FBI agent. I spent approximately 25 years with the FBI. Prior to serving with the FBI, I was a state trooper in South Carolina for 8 years. And prior to that, I was in the U.S. Marine Corps for 11 years. I am currently a pastor and have been doing so for 22 years.
Outstanding. So why did you go into law enforcement? You really progressed in it, and what kind of motivated you?
Well, sir, I actually was born and reared in the city of New York, and crime was pretty high where we lived, and there were some situations that occurred in my family. My family was a victim of crimes. So early on, I wanted to do something to help my community. And I first started with the working in the military, wanted to serve my country. And then that progressed into serving state law enforcement, then federal law enforcement.
Well, that's outstanding. Now, tell us about this concept you have as it relates to providing information and education to the community.
Thank you, sir. Looking at the crisis that our country is currently in, it really breaks my heart to see so many injustices, and it also breaks my heart to see that law enforcement has been a broad brush has been painted that all law enforcement is bad. Well, I served in law enforcement almost 34 years total. Really, that's all I've done as far as my secular job. And I thought it would be very essential to try to help people understand what law enforcement deals with, and also help people understand what African Americans deal with. I have firsthand knowledge of how there is a disparity regarding how African Americans are treated.
Okay, so were you working on this concept or this proposal or this training prior to Black Lives Matter, or did this kind of motivate you to go ahead and move forward with it?
This actually motivated me to move forward. I think there was a huge disconnect regarding the community in which we live and law enforcement. And a lot of the issues that we have can be solved based upon communication and understanding. And I thought it would be important to help people understand how a law enforcement officer thinks, help people understand some of the best practices that you can follow regarding law enforcement. There are some things that you can actually do that will cause situations not to become more than they need to become. And this information, unfortunately, isn't within the context of the general public. So I thought I'd share something that would perhaps save someone's life when stopped or detained by law enforcement.
Because oftentimes, and I think that it's generally agreed that in a lot of situations, the situation gravitate to a position where there's violence or crime. And in most situations, I think, and you are the law enforcement officer, you correct me, at some point, these occurrences were preventable. Is that true?
Yes, sir, that's very true. That's very true. There are situations that can be prevented. And one thing that I really stress on is how a person should respond when stopped. And also there are it's very important to understand that there are some dispositions that some officers have. Training is a very important aspect. I talk about training as well, but there are some ways that you can actually react so situations won't become very bad situations.
So now exactly how do you plan to disseminate this? What's your concept, which I think is very good, the format, the information, the education. So how do you want, no. Well, whichever you want to do first. Either you can talk about the specifics of the program. Talk about that first, then we want to talk about how you want to get it out into the community.
Thank you, sir. So the specifics of the program, I first actually provide some factual information regarding actions against African-American males. It's a fact, and everyone knows that a lot of there is a huge disparity as it relates to what happens with African-American males. That's a fact. I've actually seen that firsthand. So I initially talk about information in that regard. I also deal with some subtle aspects of racism that go unnoticed by the general public. There are some things that we deal with, even when I was, before I retired, even when I was stopped by law enforcement for perhaps a traffic infraction or just anything, I was always cautious. I always reacted a certain way as well because I know how they react and what they're looking for. So I talk about some subtle aspects of racism. I talk about perception versus reality, and this is really important to me. I'm certainly pro law enforcement. I think we need law enforcement, and And unfortunately, there is, unfortunately, when a bad officer surfaces, that actually paints a picture on all law enforcement. And that's just not true. So I talk about perception versus reality. I have, as I mentioned, I've been in law enforcement almost 35 years, and they're some of the most conscious people that I know. However, there are some that aren't, and I work with some who weren't as well. So I talk about that. I talk about the general mindset of an officer. I talk about what he's thinking and why he thinks the way he thinks, so that people can understand why they do what they do. A lot of the things that officers have is judgment. They can actually give a person a citation or not. It actually depends upon sometimes the circumstances of the stop. And if you're polite and if you don't do certain things, you might just be given a warning. And that's depends upon departmental rules as well. So I'll talk about the judgment of the officer. I talk about the importance of training, and training is absolutely critical. And as I'm doing these things, I'm educating the public regarding what an officer is exposed to. Some small departments don't have a lot of training. It depends upon their budget. And when that's the case, a person that's faced with a very difficult situation always reverts back to their dispositions or predispositions. So if there isn't training, a lot of training available, you may see a lot of the things that are happening in the country today. Another thing I talk about is weapons. You know, Georgia is a state. Everyone has a weapon. I talk about how you should handle that weapon. If you're stopped in a vehicle and you have a weapon, I talk about the best practices regarding how to handle a weapon when stopped. And another thing that I deal with, I talk about the environment. A lot of times if an officer is in a very bad environment, sometimes there's a really high crime environment. Sometimes that will affect how he or she responds. And the main thing I talk about, and this is what I want to provide to young African Americans, male and female, and other minorities, what policemen look for. There are some specific things that policemen look for, and in that there are ways that a person can present themselves in a less threatening profile. Sometimes, depending upon how you do certain things, actually heightens your profile and puts a policeman on alert. So I talk about ways to present, to be a less threatening profile. And just talk about some unknown biases that sometimes people have. So it's a program to really educate African Americans and different minorities regarding the best practices when they're arrested, detained, or stopped by law enforcement. And quite frankly, in this culture that we're in, as African Americans, we have to make the assumption that we're going to be stopped for something. And that stop can be one that's a bad one, and it can be one that's not so bad, depending upon how you react and respond.
Very, very good. And that's very, very crucial information. Okay, now, when you say you talk about what kind of format are you interested in presenting? Now, I thought after having taken a look at what you have put together, and after having determined, which I already knew, that what you're doing is extremely important and can be extremely and measurably beneficial, but it's no good sitting on your desk.
Yes,
So
sir.
we need to get that information out to the public as it relates to, I'm gonna put you on the spot because I asked you, I said, well, how much does your training seminar cost? And you said, well, I'm doing this at no cost. I'm doing it, talk about that. Why are you doing it at no cost?
Yes, sir. I really feel that something needs to be done, and it's so important to me that I have chosen to do this just to educate. If I can share information and save one person's life,
Yes, sir.
that means all the world to me.
Yes,
So
sir.
I want to, and the information that I have can be presented in faith-based venues and also secular type venues as well. It's general information. It really educates people regarding how law enforcement thinks and how they should respond when they're dealing with a law enforcement person.
Right. This is a call to action. I'm your host, Alex Habersham, interviewing uh, Mr. Gregory McClendon, who's a pastor, ex-law enforcement officer, person very concerned about the community. And he didn't just have the concern, he has decided to come up with a program and a format and a presentation that can be presented to groups that will help to the purpose is to kind of alleviate some of the tension and the pain and the unfortunate situations that we often find ourselves in, particularly as it relates to the law enforcement. So you were talk about your role as an FBI, that which you can talk about, because I think, Mr. McClendon, I think it's important, although, through maybe your modesty or what have you, you didn't really emphasize that based on your training and your experience, you know what you're talking about,
Yes, sir.
so
Thank
this
you.
is not, so I think it's important that your presentation and your projecting this to the community is experience and evidence-based. So if you would just kind of talk about your experience and, and the kind of jobs you've had and the situations, because it's important,
Thank you,
and
sir.
what I'm hopeful of is that particularly since you want to do this, what I'm hearing, I think, is that you can do it at community centers, you can do
Yes,
it
sir.
at churches, you can do it at the Boys and Girls Club, you can do it at the Boy Scouts, you can do it for nonprofit organizations,
Yes, sir.
that you just want youth training program, Department of Juvenile Justice, wherever.
Yes, sir.
So I think it's important. So talk about uh, your experience and the kind of evidence, if you please, that you collected as a result of being a law enforcement officer.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yes, as I mentioned, I first worked in state law enforcement for 8 years in South Carolina, and that involved dealing with people every day, a lot of very um, tough situations, but being right there with people, even on various teams. As a state trooper, I was actually on the riot control team, so I really dealt with the nitty gritty of people in that regard. Stopping people all the time, talking to people, dealing with people, doing various things all over the state of South Carolina. So that gave me a lot of experience dealing with people on a daily basis of all races. It also showed me that there is a lot of racism out there. I experienced a lot of that as a state trooper, just dealing with the general public. The FBI was a lot different. I was actually the first African American in the Middle District of Georgia assigned in the FBI, and of course I made an oath I can't talk about the details of what I did, but I worked crimes of various types, from violent crimes to white collar crimes to public corruption to financial crimes to internet crimes. So I really dealt with people in all genres, from people that would be considered low socioeconomic class to people that were very wealthy. So my experience covers a big gamut in regards to dealing with people and various crimes that I worked.
Yeah, yeah. Now, based on your research, and I know that everybody probably could benefit from it, but I know that you kind of want to arrange it to the point where it will have the most impact. I'm talking about your training on the most affected group.
Yes, sir.
So, how, based on your research, how do you visualize presenting it to the most important groups, at least as a beginning?
Yes, in a very simplistic way, I do have a PowerPoint presentation. I have information that I can hand out, and I have some very, very simple bullet points that I can share. One that's very simplistic in regards to when confronted with law enforcement. If you're in your vehicle and you're stopped, one of the worst things that you can do is do a lot of moving in your vehicle. You should really limit your activity. In fact, even as a retired law enforcement, if I'm ever stopped for something, the first thing I do is put both of my hands out of the window so the officer can know that I have no intentions of doing any harm to him. So the first thing I do is to make sure that the officer knows that I have no intention of doing any harm to him. Another very simple thing is a lot of people have tinted windows. That is a very difficult, a very dangerous thing to have when an officer approaches a vehicle. I talk to kids about if you have tinted windows, let those windows down. And what that does, that gives the officer, that says something to him. But if you're in the vehicle and the windows are up and you're doing all this moving, those are situations that can really become problematic. So I'm using very things that are very simple, things that kids understand, that I really believe will help them survive an encounter with law enforcement.
Well, are there any other simple ones? Because although they may be simple, they make a whole lot of sense. And then, sometimes we assume that people know when really
Right.
they don't. They never
Right.
thought about it. So, show your hands, roll the window down, I thought tinted windows were against the law anyway, but maybe they aren't. But, show your hands and, let them see it and don't make any funny moves. What other kind of things that can be helpful to somebody?
Yes, sir. Another thing is when you're blue lighted, pull over as soon as possible. When a person doesn't pull over, that could be an indication that they might be hiding something, or they might possibly try to run away. Another thing is if an officer sees the park indicator light come on, if somebody's shifting a gear, that could potentially be that they might try to run. Towels and blankets in a vehicle can be suspicious. You might, sometimes people hide open containers, or they hide contraband and those things. Another thing that's very simple: if a driver can't locate his registration or license, that's kind of a sign that something could be wrong. You should know where your license is. You should know where your registration is, because that's the first things that officers request. So these type things that will give people tools to help officers do their jobs.
Okay, that's very good. So how long would your training take, and what's your preference for location? Because there are a lot of, you can, like I said, there are several organizations, entities, and institutions that possibly could benefit from it. So how long is the presentation?
The presentation is no more than 30 minutes. So, and of course, we have a question and answer session as well. And a lot of times people have questions that, I like to discuss. And this is, and this really provides an open forum for understanding. And I know officers that would love to be part of this as well. I'm still in contact with a lot of officers, that are currently working. And it's my intention to help understanding and really bridge the gaps, because that's what the problem is. There's some gaps of understanding.
That's outstanding. Well, give us information as I know everybody wants to see and hear your presentation because it's so meaningful and has so much potential. So how can one get in touch with you?
Yes, sir. They can call me by my number. I have two numbers. I have a church secretary that actually helps me with this, but they can, I give them my cell number. All my members have my cell number, and my number is 478-318-9478. 478-318-9478. My church number, my secretary she answered these calls, is 478-627-9352. 478-627-9352. That's going to go to Christ Chapel, and that'll go to my secretary, and she will get in contact with me.
Well, I'm your host, Alex Habersham of A Call to Action, having interviewed a very, very phenomenal person who is an ex-law enforcement officer who has put together a very, very phenomenal program designed to assist and educate the community on some important factors about law enforcement and being stopped, and attitudes of the officer as well as the person being stopped, in an effort to try to bridge the gap and to reduce the instances of problematic situation. I want to thank you, Mr. McClendon, and for two reasons. I want to thank you for being on the show, and I want to thank you for being concerned enough to put together this presentation in an effort to help the community. And I'm sure that you'll get a lot of calls because it's sorely needed in our community. This is A Call to Action. I'm your host, Alex Habersham. Thanks to the ex-law enforcement officer, Mr. McClendon, again. Have a great day.